This fiery shirt started out as a plain white shirt from my local thrift store. Join me to see how I hand dyed it and added 3 different Shibori-inspired stitch resist patterns to it. Hi, I'm Kristen. Welcome to the Dye School, where I teach you how to hand dye all the things to color your world. This is a 100% cotton button-down shirt from ASOS that I bought at a thrift store. It is subtly color blocked with white cream and gray fabrics featured on different parts of the shirt. It has a gathered high-low peplum. I thought it would be cool to do 3 different kinds of stitched and tied Shibori-inspired patterns on different sections of the shirt to echo the 3 different shades of fabric. Because I ultimately end up pulling the crap out of this thread to create the resists, I use super strong Coats & Clark brand outdoor polyester thread with a long, stout hand sewing needle. The needle I use is about 1.5 inches long because it's easier to pile the stitches on a long needle like this one when you stitch the resist patterns. The first pattern is called wood grain. I make basically parallel lines of stitching about 7/8 inch apart from each other. When I finish the stitching, I pull the edge threads taut and push the fabric together, then tie the edge threads together to secure them. I decided to use this pattern on the peplum and learned quickly that there's miles of fabric in a gathered peplum. Because there's so much stitching, I became lazier and lazier about keeping stitches consistent. It still turned out nice. For the arc sample, I use a small picture as a template and draw around half of it with a chalk pencil. On the shirt, I use a colander as a template to make a larger arc and then freehand the smaller concentric arcs. On the shirt, I use a colander as a template to make a larger arc and then freehand the smaller concentric arcs. The circle pattern is a simple bound resist rather than a stitched resist. Pinch up a section of fabric into a point, secure the thread, wrap it tightly around the pinched portion and tie off. This makes a circle or target shaped resist. I use this pattern on the sleeves of the shirt. I admit that I got fast and furious toward the end of the stitching, and so it looks a bit hurried. If this were hand stitching that would show forever, I certainly would have taken my time, but since it's stitching for a resist and it'll be taken out after the shirt is dyed, I was about as careful as I wanted to be. Even so, it took about 8 hours to finish all the stitched resists for this shirt. I left unknotted tails at each end of the lines of stitching so that I could pull them taut to make the resists. Each of the threads is pulled, tightened, and tied off so that it stays knotted during dyeing. This compresses the fabric, which keeps the dye from penetrating areas of the fabric, which is what makes the pattern. For some reason, I don't have footage showing the arc patterns with their threads tightened up, but all those stitched lines you see were compressed just like the wood grain pattern on the peplum. The first step to dyeing the shirt is to weigh it. Since I like to match dye color recipes that I have in my own custom color book, taking the weight of what I'm going to dye is a very important first step. Using a food scale to set to grams, the shirt weighs 236 grams. Before I started stitching the shirt, I washed it normally with other clothing in a regular sized washing machine. Here, I put the shirt in warm water with a tiny bit of detergent called Synthropol, and I do mean a tiny bit, literally a couple of drops, just to help the water penetrate the fabric. Wetting the shirt before it goes into the dye helps the dye wick into the fabric more easily. I choose this fire red color from my dye swatch book for the shirt. If you want the formula I use to create this color and other free resources for hand dyers, follow the link in the description below to join the Color Collective, my free community for makers like you. This fire color is a mixture of two primary colors of fiber reactive dye powder at 4% depth of shade. Spoiler alert, this changes later on, as you'll see. All that means is that the total amount of dye powder is 4% of the total weight of the shirt. I put the two colors together in a cup, add warm water and a drop of Synthropol, and stir until the dye powder dissolves. I pour the dye solution into a plastic tub that already has water in it and stir it to fully dissolve the dye. Finally, I take the soaked shirt and put it in the dye bath. I press it down to sink it into the dye solution and stir gently to assure that the dye penetrates the shirt. At this point, there's just water and dye and a little bit of Synthropol in the dye bath. While salt is not a dye fixative, that is, it does not make the dye molecules adhere to the fabric nor make the color more permanent, it does help the dye reaction happen and create more even color on the fabric. The amount of salt used is related to the deepness of the color and the amount of dye used. This is called DOS, DOS, or depth of shade. For greater than 2% DOS, 50 grams per liter of water is recommended, which is a lot of salt. I used less than half that amount and things turned out fine. Soda ash is the chemical that does make the dye adhere to the fabric. It creates an actual bond to the fibers, which is why fiber reactive dye is so light fast and wash fast on cotton and other cellulose fibers. It seems like magic, but it's actually chemistry. Because the color I chose is greater than 2% depth of shade, I use 8 grams per liter of soda ash, or about 144 grams total, added in 2 intervals. Take care when you mix the soda ash. Constant stirring and slow mixing keeps it from turning into a giant undissolved chunk in the bottom of the container. I pull the shirt to the side and pour the dissolved soda ash into the dye bath. I stir the dye bath thoroughly to completely incorporate the soda ash. At this point, I start thinking that the color isn't dark enough, so I decide to double the amount of dye that I added originally. I weigh the same amounts of dye powder that I did before, dissolve it in water, and add it to the dye bath. This effectively doubles the amount of dye I had initially to a total of 8% depth of shade. I add the second half of the soda ash to the dye bath by pulling aside the shirt and stirring to incorporate, just like I did before. At this point in the process, I always get impatient and want to yank it out and look at it, but time is an essential part of the dye reaction too, so for now, I have to be content with stirring and poking at the shirt. If you'd like a written version of this dye process and other free resources for hand dyers, check out the link in the description below to join the Color Collective, my free community for hand dyers. Rinsing is also an essential part of the hand dyeing process and one that's easy to shortchange. I start with a cool water rinse to reduce the amount of unreacted dye coming off the shirt. Gradually, I increase the temperature of each rinse. I keep the threads on the shirt. With each successive rinse, the water will be less and less colored. With fiber reactive dyes like this, there will never be a clear dye bath at the end of the dye time, like with acid dyes on wool, for instance. There will always be unreacted dye, and dye that reacts with the water itself, so don't think you've done something wrong. That's just the way it is. You can see that the water is less and less orange the more I rinse. After hand rinsing for a while, I put the still bound shirt into a tiny portable washing machine with some Synthropol for a 15-minute wash, then rinse it some more. Peeking around the still tight threads, I can see that there are lighter areas under the resists. Exciting! This is the best part, finally seeing the new color and how the threads make the patterning. But I don't get too excited yet because I wait overnight for the shirt to fully dry before I cut away the threads. Finally, I clip away the knots and stitching to reveal the wood grain pattern. It's so satisfying to pull apart the fabric to see how the dye created different shades, well, technically tints, on the white fabric. Just like the stitching itself took a while, snipping to unstitch the thread takes a while too. I use my rainbow unicorn embroidery scissors to make it more entertaining. Check out the white stitching at the hem and where the peplum is sewn to the body of the shirt. That shows that the thread used was polyester. Fiber reactive dyes do not dye polyester, so the thread remains white. The thread I used for the resist is also polyester, so it stayed the original paint color. The shirt retains deep wrinkles from when it was bound, so I pull the fabric apart and smooth it. Later, I wash it again in cool water in a regular washing machine and steam press it with my iron to remove remaining wrinkles. You can see that the care content and brand label is also polyester because it remained undyed. So many threads. I just keep picking out stitching. Next, I cut the threads binding the circles on the sleeves of the shirt. It's so interesting to see how different each circle is from the other one, even though it's the same technique used for each one. I'm very careful to cut only the thread and not the shirt fabric. The fish in the background is my coffee table. It has a glass top that doesn't show very well in the video. Finally, I cut the stitching on the arc patterns. I like how this pattern could be used to make any kind of a line on the fabric. You could basically draw with the stitching to create whatever pattern you'd like. At last, all the stitching is gone, revealing all three different patterns. Remember that the shirt had three different colors of fabric to start: bright white, cream, and gray. You can see how different the collar looks from the rest of the shirt because it was gray originally, so the gray combined with the fire red creates sort of a rust color. Thanks for following along with this project with me. Does anyone actually watch the outro on YouTube videos? Ha! Please like and subscribe for more hand dyeing fun.